I would like to thank a few of the people that have helped today possible. The Hispano Chamber of Commerce sponsored an ice cream social yesterday afternoon that allowed some of our students to interact with some speakers. The Energy Alliance of New Mexico and Don Mayberry provided the resources for the speaker room and the refreshments. For those of you who are not here but are looking in, these proceedings are being streamed live video over the internet, and indeed the PowerPoint presentations will appear on the Energy Center's website at the conclusion of our ceremony. So with that, we'll start our next panel.
Thank you very much. My name is Charlie Smith. I am the chairman of the Economic Development Corporation of Lee County. Again, I add my special thanks to you for your attendance here today as we begin panel number 2, Renewable Energy and Crisis, Cost and Carbon. I think we have 3 excellent panelists for this discussion. We will introduce those to you at this time. Our first panelist will be Laura Miller. Laura, of course, is a former mayor of the city of Dallas. She served in that capacity from 2002 until 2007. She is very proud of her environmental accomplishments, including the formation of the Texas Clean Air Cities Coalition, made up of 36 cities, counties, and school districts in Texas. And incidentally, that group opposed the construction of 11 pulverized nuclear coal plants and got that number reduced down quite a bit. That will be an upcoming series or a film, Goliath and the Texas Coal Wars. That should be an interesting documentary. She served 3.5 years on the Dallas City Council and worked for 17 years prior to that as an award-winning investigative reporter and newspaper columnist in the cities of Miami, New York, and Dallas. She is closely working now in an area very near to us with Colorado-based Summit Power to develop the world's first clean coal IGCC power plant with carbon capture in the Midland-Odessa FutureGen site. The second panelist this morning will be Dr. Daniel Fine, a research associate at New Mexico Tech and Center for Energy Policy. Previously, he was a research associate at MIT and a participant in the Harvard University Business School Project Energy Futures. He is a member of the Atlantic Council Working Group on Central Asian and Russian energy and a contributing editor for Engineering and Mining Journal. Our third panelist this morning will be Nick Hodson, who is a partner in the consulting company McKinsey & Company based in San Francisco, California. After Nick graduated from Oxford University in geology, he worked in the oil industry for 5 years and then earned his MBA at INSEAD, the famous business school in France. Nick is a leader in McKinsey's Climatic Change Special Initiative and Clean Tech Practice. And increasingly, Nick has been working with his clients to help them understand, shape, and react to the emerging new energy markets. I have been asked to remind you that as you go forward in these presentations, in order to speed up things, that as you think of questions in the presentations, you go ahead and jot those down so that you'll be ready when those are called for. At the end of the presentation, Mr. Joe Puckett, who is the market president of Wells Fargo Bank here in Hobbs, will moderate the discussion and be open for questions. This time I would like to ask Laura Miller to begin this panel. Ms. Miller.
Good morning. If someone had told me 2 years ago that I was going to go to New Mexico and I was going to follow a very interesting panel on clean power from solar and wind, and that I was going to get up next and advocate that we build a coal plant, I would have told them they were crazy. When I was mayor of Dallas from 2002 to 2007, I started out knowing next to nothing about electricity and power and energy. Ironically, my husband, Steve Woolens, was a member of the Texas legislature at the time, and in 1999, he wrote and got passed and advocated on his own with a state senator the dereg bill for electricity for the state of Texas. And he would come home and sit down at dinner with me and my children and talk incessantly about electricity and megawatts and kilowatts, and I'd tell him I was bored stiff and don't talk to me anymore. And now all I do is talk about that. So I'm very, very happy to be here today. And I have to tell you that driving up here with Hoxie Smith from Midland, it sure seemed like a good idea when I got to Hobbs that maybe we build a little IGCC plant with carbon capture right here with all the EOR that you all are doing and the oil floods. But let me tell you a little bit about why I have an extreme love-hate relationship with coal. And this panel is going to talk a little bit about carbon. I think the important message from the last panel is that you got to have a mix of everything. When we decided to fight the coal plants in Texas several years ago, our city council was horrified at the idea that Texas already has 18 pulverized coal plants. Pulverized coal meaning combustion coal, where you burn the coal and a lot of those pollutants go up the stack, including, as you know, a whole lot of carbon dioxide. And whether or not you believe in greenhouse gases and whether the polar bears are dying because of it and the ice caps are melting, the very fact is that the Obama administration is going to do something about carbon. And that's going to affect all of us, especially the folks in New Mexico and Texas. Texas emits more carbon dioxide than any other state in the country. In fact, it's the 7th largest emitter in the world if Texas was its own country, which sometimes it thinks it is. And so carbon dioxide has to be dealt with. And one of the reasons why we on the Dallas City Council were concerned about the coal plants was not only because of the CO2, but also because of the NOx and the ozone. As you all also know, sulfur comes off a coal plant, mercury, NOx, which creates ozone and smog. And there are 3 parts of Texas that are no longer in compliance with the Federal Clean Air Act. Houston and Dallas are 2 of the big ones. Houston is the 4th most polluted city in America, and Dallas, believe it or not, is the 7th most polluted city in America. So we had a lot of concern about doubling the number of coal plants. We weren't necessarily opposed to coal per se, but we were very opposed to the way that the utility companies were planning to use it. And that's why we organized our group. We had 36 cities, counties, and school districts. We raised $600,000 in private money. And with that money, we hired the University of Texas to do the most comprehensive air modeling that had ever been done in the history of the state. And the University of Texas told us, if all 18 plants are built in Texas, doubling the number of plants, you won't have 3 areas of non-attainment, the 3 parts of the state that are out of compliance with the Federal Clean Air Act. You'll have 6. And if you have 6, then you've got a whole lot of problems with economic development, with federal monies that get cut off for being in violation of the Clean Air Act that come to your state. You have trouble getting companies to move and locate and live and want to work in your community. So we oppose the plants. And one of the things I kept saying to TXU, because TXU was proposing 11 of those 18, was I kept saying, why don't you do something called IGCC, which is a clean coal gasification technology? And because I knew very little about what I was talking about, they came back and said to me, well, that doesn't exist. It's a technology that's just out there, it's talked about, it's going to come someday, but it just isn't ready for prime time. And I got so frustrated hearing that all the time that one day I got in an airplane with half the city council and we went to Tampa, Florida. Because in Tampa, Florida, they have an IGCC clean coal plant that makes electricity. There's only 2 in the country, 1 in Tampa and 1 in Indiana. And the federal government helped build them 20 years ago when natural gas prices were high, and the government thought, why don't we take this old technology? Because I don't know if you know this, but gasification was used in Germany during World War II. When they started having trouble with resources, the Germans started to take coal and gasify it. And that's what it is. You take coal and you turn it into a gas, a synthetic natural gas. And way back in the 1800s, cities like London and lots of cities in the United States used coal and made gas and used it in their lights on their streets as town gas that lit up your street. So it's a very old technology. So I said, let's do IGCC, and TXU said no. And I came back from Tampa, and I had something in my luggage, because TXU had said, even if the technology exists, it takes a very specialized, high-quality, high-heat-rate coal from the Appalachian Mountains, from little towns, and there's so little of it available for this technology to work that we just can't roll it out across the country. And the first question I asked the plant manager in Tampa was, what kind of specialized Appalachian coal do you use in your plant? And they said, we use pet coke sludge from Houston. So I took it back in my shoe so I could show TXU. Well, fast forward, after losing the battle on convincing TXU to build IGCC, because I'll have you know that since those two plants were built 20 years ago in Florida and Indiana, there are no other IGCC plants that have been built in the United States. There are a whole lot of them being built over in Europe. So after I left office, and we did successfully, and a lot of it was also in the environmental pressure that came from environmental defense and NRDC. TXU, when they were bought out, agreed to go from 11 proposed coal plants to 3. Now, unfortunately, the 3 that they're building are the dirtiest of the 11, but there was some victory in lowering the number of plants. But when I left office, I was still intrigued with coal gasification, and so I went to Europe with some foundations. It took about 30 elected officials and former elected officials to Europe to look at those gasification plants. And after touring them, on the way home, I said to the groups, the folks that we were with, I said, you know, this is a wonderful technology. When you take the coal and make a gas, you take out more than 95% of the sulfur, the mercury. You bring the NOx down, so it's just about as clean as a state-of-the-art natural gas plant. All that's great. But every plant that we saw in Europe is paid for by the government, and they're not commercially viable. So why did we come? Because we've got to learn how to do these so that they make sense in the states and don't cost a lot of federal taxpayer money. And they said to me, there's one company in America that's ready to build a commercially viable plant without a big federal tax subsidy, without cap and trade. And I said, who is it? And they said, Summit Power out of Denver, Colorado. And the chairman of Summit Power is Don Hodel, who was the energy secretary for Ronald Reagan. And while I may think that the polar bears are dying and I'm worried about the ice caps, he comes from a very different political spectrum, and he believes very strongly that since the U.S. has the largest coal reserves in the world, number 1, Russia's number 2, since we have the largest stock, we're going to use it. At some point, we're going to use it. And it may not be PC today to use it, and we may indeed get cap and trade, but as long as you've got coal in the earth, you're going to use it. In China today, one pulverized coal plant, one dirty coal plant, a week is built. Every week, there's a new coal plant that comes online. And they don't have modern technology in those plants. And they're very, very dirty plants. And you can see from all the air pollution problems I have over there why they have those problems. India is the same. Almost one a week is currently being built. So when I talked to Summit a year and 2 months ago, I said to them, if you can really do this, then I want to help you do it. And I was still chairman of the coalition that was opposing the dirty coal plants. But I thought to myself, for all the energy it takes to fight a dirty coal plant, isn't it more worthwhile to spend all your time to build the one that will change the standard for the whole world, and build that one clean coal plant that will not only reduce mercury and NOx and sulfur, but will do something that no other plant in the world has done to date. No plant in the world, whether it's pulverized coal or clean coal IGCC, has captured the CO2 off those plants and done something with it to prevent it from going in the air and for contributing to this global warming problem. Well, why does Summit think they can build a clean coal plant without large federal subsidies and cap and trade? Well, the reason is really where we're sitting today and where we propose to build the first plant, which is Midland, Odessa. If you can sell all the byproducts from your plant and not have to take some of the byproducts and treat it as waste, take the sulfur instead of a pulverized coal plant saying, I have all this dirty sulfur, what do I do with it? The government's coming after me because I have too much sulfur. You take the sulfur, because you're gasifying the coal, you're doing a chemical reaction that creates different gas streams, you're turning all the molecules around and creating different chemical compounds. You take the sulfur and you sell it to the farmers to make sulfuric acid. Or like in Tampa, they make the sulfuric acid at the plant and sell it to the farmers. You take the CO2. You take the CO2, and this is so important. You take the CO2, you capture it, you liquefy it, you put it in pipelines, and they're all over this area. And then you send it to your oil fields, and you use it in depleted oil fields to pull up oil from the ground. About 15% of the oil in every field, as you all know better than me, doesn't come up by machine, but you can get it out by putting liquefied CO2 into that well, and it will bring up the oil from the well. And you sell it. So if you can sell all the byproducts from your coal plant, and you have resulting emissions that are extremely clean, it seems like these plants should have already been built all across the country. We were very far along getting our plant going when FutureGen, if you all remember FutureGen was a near zero, low emissions coal plant, just like I'm describing, that captured CO2, 90% of the CO2. And it was either going to go to Texas or it was going to go to Illinois. And on December 18th of 2007, Hoxie knows well, because Hoxie helped put together the Texas bid for the Midland-Odessa site for FutureGen. FutureGen Alliance announced that they were going to go to Illinois and not to Texas, which I think was a crazy mistake, because in Illinois, they don't do enhanced oil recovery. And in Illinois, if they capture the CO2, they have to pay to store it in the ground and watch it and make sure it doesn't leak, but they'll never get any money back from it like you will in Texas or New Mexico if you build it here and you use it for EOR. So when FutureGen went to Illinois, Hoxie called me and said, I hear you're going to go start working with this company to build this plant. Would you come build it in Midland, Odessa at our FutureGen site? And that's what we've been working to do the last year. I met this lovely woman from the League of Women Voters here a few minutes ago, and we were talking about renewables and all these things, and I asked her about clean coal, and she said, well, I don't believe in it. And one of the great challenges for people like me is to go out and talk about why there is such a thing as clean coal. It distresses me when Al Gore and Robert Kennedy Jr. get up in front of lots of different committees in Washington, and they say very emphatically, there is no such thing as clean coal. Clean coal is a lie and a myth. Well, fundamentally, if you go in the ground or you cut off a mountain and you take out the coal, it's a dirty process, and you can't change that. I do believe that it would be great for Washington to not allow any more mountaintop excavation, and there's plenty of coal in Wyoming and other places in the ground where you can take it out of the ground and do a great reclamation job, and that's where I think the coal ought to be coming from. Our biggest reserves in America anyway are in Wyoming, the Powder River Basin coal, which we plan to use at Midland, Odessa. But so if you take aside the fact that getting the coal out of the ground is dirty, putting it in train cars and shipping it across the country, it takes about 1.5 mile long train per day for one plant, which is a whole lot of coal. That's dirty. And the railroads are working on all kinds of ways to prevent coal dust from coming off of trains. But once you get it to the plant, clean coal technology, integrated coal gasification combined cycle technology exists today. It performs today. CO2 capture performs today on chemical plants such as the one in North Dakota. Enhanced oil recovery has been going on just south of here in Midland, Odessa for 30 years. And they get 33 million tons a day of CO2 that goes into those wells and brings up oil and makes money for their states. So all those components are real. Putting them together is the challenge. Yes, it's expensive. Because of the terrible economy, we are now asking to receive stimulus funds in the form of a loan for the project for us to build at Midland, Odessa, because we can't put together $1.6 billion in today's market. It's very difficult. We have a bill in the Texas legislature that gives a tax break to oil producers who use the man-made CO2 as opposed to the natural CO2. All the CO2 that you all are using is being taken out of the ground and piped in for enhanced oil recovery, which to environmentalists is anathema when they want to be capturing CO2 and putting it in the ground. So the last three-legged piece of that stool is that we also need a transmission priority in West Texas. As Hoxie mentioned, we are doubling the amount of wind in the West Texas region in the CREZ zone, which is wonderful. But when all that wind is on the line, nothing else can go. And if you're going to make money on a base load plant like clean coal, you've got to run 24/7. So we're asking the PUC, if you capture at least 70% of the carbon on a clean coal plant that's IGCC, you ought to be able to run 24/7 even if the wind is blowing. So I'm here to talk about the clean coal issue. I think Hobbs, New Mexico would be a great place to have one of these plants, and we're going to hear a little bit about cap and trade and the big picture on carbon. But I do think that coal is here to stay and that Americans ought to insist that it be done in the cleanest way possible. Thank you for having me.